The thing about diplomatic service, Elias Chen reflected while trying not to fidget in formal attire that was slightly too warm for the throne room's carefully controlled climate, was that it involved far more standing around looking appropriately serious than anyone mentioned during recruitment. He'd been in the Lydian Empire's capital for 3 days, participating in the kind of elaborate ceremonial exchanges that major civilizations use to demonstrate their cultural sophistication, while everyone involved tried very hard not to say anything that might cause diplomatic incidents. The throne room itself was impressive in ways that clearly required significant architectural expertise and probably enormous expense. The ceiling rose into calculated dimness that made the space feel vast without being overwhelming, punctuated by light sources that highlighted specific areas, primarily the throne itself, which sat at the chamber's focal point like the center of a carefully designed solar system. The walls were carved with what Elias assumed were historically significant scenes, though he hadn't had time to research their specific meanings beyond important cultural heritage that visiting dignitaries should appreciate. Princess Calith occupied the throne with the kind of natural authority that suggested she'd been performing this role her entire life, which, according to the briefing materials, she essentially had been. The Lydian succession system meant she'd been designated heir at age 7 and had spent the subsequent 18 years being prepared for eventual rule through combination of education, public service, and exactly this kind of formal ceremonial duty. She was currently 25, which made her younger than Elias by approximately a decade, but she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd long ago accepted that her life would be public performance as much as personal experience. The ceremony had been proceeding according to schedule for the past 90 minutes. Various dignitaries approached the throne in order of precedence that someone had spent considerable time calculating, delivered formal greetings that had probably been reviewed by multiple advisors, and presented symbolic gifts that represented their civilization's cultural achievements or economic capabilities. Princess Calith responded to each presentation with appropriate grace, her replies carefully calibrated to honor the presenter while maintaining the diplomatic neutrality that her position required. Elias had participated in the required elements. His turn to approach the throne had come approximately 40 minutes into the ceremony, and he delivered the formal greeting that had been prepared by the human diplomatic corps, presented the symbolic gift that had been selected after considerable debate about what would appropriately represent humanity's technological achievements without seeming ostentatious, and received the princess's courteous acknowledgement before returning to his position among the assembled dignitaries. Since then, he'd been standing near the western colonnade, observing the proceedings with professional attention while carefully avoiding direct eye contact with the princess. It wasn't fear exactly, though the briefing materials had been explicit about Lydian cultural sensitivity to perceived disrespect and the importance of maintaining proper protocol during formal audiences. It was more that Elias had developed over years of diplomatic service, a strong instinct to maintain appropriate boundaries with powerful individuals, to avoid the kind of personal entanglement that complicated professional relationships. He'd read the briefing materials about Princess Calith with more attention than he usually gave to cultural profiles, partly because the Lydian Empire was genuinely significant political entity whose cooperation humanity valued, and partly because her specific situation reminded him uncomfortably of people he'd known who'd lived their entire lives in public view and had paid psychological costs for that visibility. She'd been designated heir at 7, had spent 18 years being prepared for rule. Every decision she made was analyzed by court officials and political observers. Every relationship she formed was filtered through calculations about power and influence. Every moment of her public life, which was essentially all of her life, was performance for audiences who saw her as symbol rather than person. And Elias, who'd spent 15 years watching how diplomatic relationships could become exploitative when power differentials were too large, who'd seen how people in positions of authority often struggled to maintain genuine personal connections because everyone around them wanted something, who developed strong protective instinct against contributing to that particular kind of isolation. Well, he decided to maintain respectful distance, to participate in required ceremonies without seeking personal recognition, to be professionally appropriate without adding to the complex dynamics that already surrounded someone in her position, which had apparently been noticeable enough that the princess had just stopped the formal ceremony to ask him about it directly. "The human envoy standing near the western colonnade," she said, her voice carrying across the chamber with clear authority that made every conversation stop immediately. "Ambassador Chen, I believe. You have maintained careful distance throughout this audience, and you have not once met my eyes directly despite multiple opportunities to do so during formal exchanges. I wish to understand why." The throne room went absolutely silent. Elias felt the weight of approximately 300 people's attention focus on him simultaneously, felt the sudden pressure of being unexpectedly visible in situation where he'd been trying very hard to remain professionally peripheral. Around him, he could sense other dignitaries making rapid calculations about what his answer might mean for diplomatic relations, how this unexpected break in protocol might create opportunities or complications. Princess Caliph was looking at him with expression he couldn't quite read. Not angry, not accusatory, but genuinely curious in a way that suggested this wasn't political positioning but actual question about behavior that had apparently caught her attention. Elias had approximately 3 seconds to decide how to respond. He could offer diplomatic deflection, could claim he was simply following proper protocol or demonstrating appropriate deference to her position, could perform the kind of careful non-answer that satisfied formality without revealing anything genuine. The safe play, the professionally appropriate response, would be to bow and apologize for any perceived disrespect, while assuring her that he meant only to show proper respect for her authority. But she'd asked a direct question with what sounded like genuine curiosity, and Elias had never been particularly good at diplomatic evasion when someone asked him something honest. And there was something in her expression, maybe loneliness, maybe exhaustion with constant performance, maybe just desire for one interaction that wasn't entirely scripted, that made him choose honesty over safety. He took a breath, centered himself the way he'd learned to do before potentially saying things that might complicate his life, and spoke clearly enough that the throne room's acoustics would carry his words to everyone assembled. "Your Highness, I'm not afraid of you in the way I think you might mean. I'm not intimidated by your power, or your species, or your position, or any of the things that might cause someone to avoid direct engagement with royalty." He paused, making sure he had the words right before continuing. "What I fear is something different. I fear how easily someone in your position stops being seen as a person and becomes only a symbol, only a role, only a representation of something larger than themselves. Every person in this room, myself included, looks at you and sees Princess first, sees the weight of the crown and the responsibilities of your position and the political significance of your decisions. And I understand that's inevitable given your role, but I also understand that it creates a particular kind of isolation." The silence in the throne room had shifted quality, from shocked attention to something more intent, as people processed what he was saying. Elias kept his focus on the princess, watching her expression shift through emotions he couldn't quite identify. "I maintain distance," he continued, "because I don't want to contribute to that reduction. Don't want to be another person who looks at you and sees only princess rather than caliph, who treats you as though you're defined entirely by your title, rather than being an actual individual experiencing the weight of that title. I fear the loneliness that comes from being constantly visible but rarely truly seen, and I don't want to add to it by pretending that casual interaction with me would somehow be different from all the other carefully calculated exchanges you navigate daily. He met her eyes for the first time, holding the contact deliberately. So I maintain respectful distance not because I think you're dangerous or unapproachable, but because I think you deserve to have some boundaries that aren't constantly being crossed by people who want something from you or want to claim connection to power you represent. My distance is not rejection. It's respect for the fact that you're a person who happens to hold enormous responsibility, and that person probably needs some space that isn't filled with people performing diplomatic theater. But Elias stopped, suddenly aware that he just delivered what amounted to psychological analysis of an alien princess in front of her entire court, and that this was either going to be appreciated as honest respect or condemned as presumptuous overreach. The throne room remained absolutely silent, and he couldn't tell from anyone's expression which direction this was going to fall. Princess Calith stared at him for approximately 10 seconds that felt considerably longer, her expression cycling through surprise, recognition, something that might have been pain or might have been relief, and finally settling on careful composure that probably required significant effort to maintain. "Among my people," she said finally, her voice carrying emotional weight that formal occasions usually didn't allow, "fear has always meant weakness or hostility. Those who fear us either submit or oppose us. No one has ever framed fear as empathy, as recognition of personhood beneath position, as deliberate choice to maintain boundaries out of respect rather than intimidation." She stood from the throne, apparently another protocol violation based on the subtle reactions rippling through the court, and walked down the steps toward Elias with measured pace that gave him time to process that this interaction had definitely departed from ceremonial script. "You maintain distance not because you think I'm beneath your notice or above your station, but because you recognize that my position creates isolation and you refuse to contribute to it." She stopped approximately 3 meters from him, maintaining space even as she closed the distance. "That is possibly the most respectful thing anyone has said to me in formal setting in my entire life." Calith had been preparing for this ceremonial audience for 3 days, reviewing the profiles of attending dignitaries, memorizing appropriate responses to expected presentations, and generally performing the kind of elaborate preparation that her role required for any public function. She'd learned young that being heir meant every public moment was performance, that spontaneity was liability rather than asset, and that the safest approach to formal occasions was careful adherence to protocol that had been refined over centuries. She'd noticed Ambassador Chen during his formal presentation approximately 40 minutes into the ceremony. He delivered his greeting with appropriate respect, presented humanity's symbolic gift, a beautifully crafted model of Earth's solar system that demonstrated both artistic skill and scientific precision, and received her acknowledgement before returning to his position among the assembled dignitaries. Standard diplomatic exchange, nothing particularly memorable about the interaction itself. What had caught her attention afterward was his consistent avoidance of any further engagement. Most dignitaries, after completing their formal presentation, would seek periodic eye contact to demonstrate continued attention and respect. Some would position themselves prominently, hoping to be noticed and perhaps called upon for additional interaction. A few would make subtle gestures seeking acknowledgement or connection that might benefit their political positions. Ambassador Chen had done none of that. He'd maintained position near the western colonnade, had observed the proceedings with clear professional attention, but had carefully avoided any direct eye contact or gesture that might draw her focus back to him. And the avoidance was too consistent to be accidental. This was deliberate maintenance of distance, and Calith couldn't immediately understand why. Her first assumption had been standard diplomatic caution, perhaps concern about overstepping cultural boundaries or appearing presumptuous. But the other human dignitaries in attendance weren't maintaining the same careful distance, which suggested this was personal choice rather than cultural protocol. Her second thought had been that perhaps he'd been offended by something during the formal exchange, some unintended slight that she'd missed. But his body language didn't suggest anger or resentment, just careful neutrality. By the 90th minute of the ceremony, Caliph found herself more interested in understanding Ambassador Chen's deliberate distance than she was in the formal presentations she was supposed to be focusing on. And that irritation with her own distraction, combined with genuine curiosity about what would motivate someone to so carefully avoid engagement with her, had prompted her to break protocol and ask him directly. She'd expected diplomatic deflection, perhaps apologetic explanation about following proper protocol or demonstrating appropriate respect. What she got instead was possibly the most honest assessment of her situation that anyone had offered in formal setting in her entire public life. The human's words had hit with unexpected force, not because they were cruel or critical, but because they were accurate in ways that formal court language never quite achieved. He'd identified the exact isolation she experienced, had named the reduction from person to symbol that she'd felt since childhood but had never quite articulated, had explained his distance as deliberate respect rather than fear or disinterest. And he'd done it in front of her entire court, speaking with the kind of careful honesty that risked diplomatic consequences but apparently valued truth over safety. Caliph had stood from the throne without quite meaning to, her body responding to the emotional impact before her training could reassert control. Moving toward him was another protocol violation. She was supposed to remain elevated, supposed to maintain the physical distance that reinforced her position. But suddenly, the formal rules felt less important than acknowledging what he'd said with something more personal than ceremonial response. She'd stopped at 3 meters distance, close enough that they could speak without the entire court hearing every word, but far enough to respect the boundaries he'd been deliberately maintaining. Around them, the assembled dignitaries were absolutely silent, watching this unprecedented break in protocol with expressions ranging from fascinated to concerned. You maintain distance not because you think I'm beneath your notice or above your station, but because you recognize that my position creates isolation and you refuse to contribute to it, she said, keeping her voice level despite the emotion she was managing. That is possibly the most respectful thing anyone has said to me in formal setting in my entire life. Ambassador Chen looked uncomfortable with the attention, but not intimidated. Your Highness, I didn't mean to disrupt your ceremony or create diplomatic complications. I was simply trying to be professionally appropriate while respecting what I understood about your situation. My situation? Caliph almost smiled. You mean being designated heir at 7, spending 18 years being prepared for rule, living my entire life as public performance for audiences who see me as symbol of the empire rather than as person experiencing that role. Yes, that situation. He met her eyes directly now, apparently having decided that maintaining distance after she'd crossed it would be more awkward than engaging. I've known people who lived in public view their entire lives. I've seen the psychological cost of being constantly visible but rarely truly seen. And I thought you probably didn't need another person treating you as though access to you was prized to be won or political advantage to be gained. You thought correctly. Caliph was aware that every word of this exchange was being witnessed and would be analyzed extensively by court officials trying to understand what implications it held for human-Lydrian relations. Though I should note that your approach of maintaining distance to demonstrate respect is unusual enough that I initially interpreted it as potential disrespect or disinterest. I apologize if I caused offense. That wasn't my intention. You didn't cause offense. You caused confusion, which turned into curiosity, which prompted me to break protocol and ask you directly why you were avoiding engagement. She gestured at the assembled court. And your answer has apparently shocked my entire court into silence, which is achievement worth noting. Around them, Caliph could see her advisors making subtle gestures, suggesting she should return to the throne and resume normal ceremony. But she'd already violated protocol enough that continuing seemed less disruptive than trying to restore formality after this kind of break. Ambassador Chen, I'm going to ask you something else, and I'd appreciate honest answer rather than diplomatic deflection. I'll do my best, Your Highness. Do you actually believe that maintaining distance demonstrates more respect than engaging directly? Or are you simply uncomfortable with proximity to power and using respect as justification for avoidance? The question was more direct than formal protocol would normally allow, but Caliph had apparently committed to honest exchange, and she wanted to understand whether his explanation was genuine insight or sophisticated rationalization. Chen was quiet for a moment, considering. Both, probably. I genuinely believe that people in your position need some boundaries that aren't constantly being crossed, and I think maintaining distance is one way to honor that need. But I'm also aware that I'm uncomfortable with the kind of personal entanglement that can develop when power differentials are too large, and that discomfort probably influences my approach. So yes, there's element of self-protection in my distance, as well as element of respect for your boundaries. Honest answer. Caliph appreciated the self-awareness, and more useful than if you'd simply agreed that your motivation was entirely noble respect for my well-being. I try not to claim motivations that are entirely noble. People are usually more complicated than that, and pretending otherwise just creates expectations that can't be sustained. Caliph looked at him more carefully, processing not just what he was saying but how he was saying it. The careful honesty, the refusal to perform certainty he didn't feel, the willingness to acknowledge complexity in his own motivations. It was remarkably different from the kind of diplomatic language she usually encountered, which tended to avoid admitting any uncertainty or mixed motivation. I'm going to make a proposal, she said, making decision that would probably complicate various advisors' carefully laid plans. And you can refuse without diplomatic consequence if you prefer. But I'd like to continue this conversation in less formal setting, without 300 observers analyzing every word. Would you be willing to meet with me privately after this ceremony concludes? She could see surprise flash across his face, followed by what looked like calculation about implications. Your Highness, I'm honored by the invitation, but I should note that private meeting between you and foreign envoy will create political complications and probably prompt speculation about what was discussed and what agreements might have been reached. I'm aware. I'm willing to accept those complications if you are. Caliph smiled slightly. Considerate test of your earlier statement. You said you maintain distance out of respect for boundaries I need. I'm explicitly inviting you to cross that boundary for specific purpose. Will you maintain distance even when I request engagement, or does your approach allow for flexibility when I make my preferences clear? It was slightly manipulative framing, and Caliph saw Chen recognize that. But she also saw him consider the question seriously rather than simply deflecting with diplomatic courtesy. I'll accept your invitation, he said finally, though I reserve the right to re-establish appropriate distance if the conversation becomes uncomfortable for either of us. Agreed. We'll meet in my private chambers 1 hour after this ceremony concludes. My steward will provide you with directions and appropriate escort. Caliph turned back toward the throne, preparing to resume the formal ceremony that they disrupted. And Ambassador Chen, thank you for honest answer to my question. I recognize that speaking truth to power carries risks, and I appreciate that you chose honesty over safety. She returned to the throne, settled back into formal composure, and signaled for the ceremony to continue. But something had shifted in how she experienced the remaining presentations. The automatic performance was still there, the appropriate responses, the diplomatic grace, the careful political neutrality. But underneath it she was thinking about the human's words, about his analysis of her isolation, about the fact that someone had seen her situation clearly enough to deliberately maintain distance out of respect, rather than treating her as symbol to be approached. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Kayleigh felt genuinely curious about what someone thought beyond their political positioning, and she found herself looking forward to a conversation that hadn't been scripted by advisors or filtered through diplomatic protocol. The ceremony concluded without further disruption, various dignitaries completing their presentations and receiving appropriate acknowledgement. But Kayleigh knew that the real significance of the audience wasn't the formal exchanges. It was the unprecedented break in protocol where a human envoy had told her that her isolation was visible and that he refused to contribute to it. That honesty was worth whatever political complications emerged from the private meeting she'd arranged. And she suspected that Ambassador Chen's perspective might prove more valuable than all the carefully diplomatic advice she received from her court officials. The private chambers where Kayleigh met with Ambassador Chen were significantly less formal than the throne room. Comfortable seating, ambient lighting that didn't require anyone to perform grandeur, and enough acoustic dampening that they could speak without worrying about every word carrying to observers. Kayleigh had dismissed her usual attendants, keeping only her personal steward positioned outside the chamber to ensure privacy, while maintaining appropriate protocol about meeting with foreign dignitaries. Chen arrived precisely on time, escorted by the steward and looking considerably less comfortable than he had during the formal ceremony. Kayleigh gestured toward the seating area, deliberately choosing chairs that were positioned at equal height rather than maintaining the elevation differential that her throne required. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said once they were both settled. "I recognize this creates political complications for both of us. Your Highness, I should probably clarify something before we continue," Chen said, his tone suggesting he'd been thinking about this conversation during the intervening hour. "When I spoke earlier about maintaining distance out of respect for your boundaries, I wasn't trying to position myself as particularly noble or insightful. I was explaining my actual reasoning, which is more complicated and more self-interested than it might have sounded in formal setting. I assumed as much. People rarely act from purely altruistic motives, regardless of how they frame their choices." Kayleigh appreciated the preemptive honesty, "but I'm still interested in understanding your perspective, complicated motivations, and all." Chen was quiet for a moment, apparently organizing his thoughts. "I've been in diplomatic service for 15 years. I've worked with governments ranging from democratic collectives to hereditary monarchies to corporate oligarchies. And I've noticed pattern. People in positions of significant power, especially hereditary power, often struggle to maintain genuine personal relationships because everyone around them wants something: access to their influence, association with their status, advantage from their authority. Even relationships that start genuinely tend to become transactional over time, as the power differential creates expectations and obligations." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "I saw that pattern in your situation. Designated heir at 7, 18 years of public life. Every relationship you formed filtered through calculations about power and position. And I thought, well, I thought you probably didn't need another person approaching you with some agenda about what they could gain from association with you. So I maintained distance, not because I'm particularly noble, but because I'm uncomfortable with the kind of transactional relationship that power differentials tend to create. And now I've invited you to private meeting, which immediately creates exactly the kind of complication you were trying to avoid, Caliph observed. You're now the human envoy who has private access to the Lydrian air, which will prompt speculation about what influence you might have, what agreements might have been reached, what advantage humanity might gain from your personal relationship with me. Yes, which is uncomfortable in exactly the ways I was trying to prevent. Chen smiled slightly. Though I recognize that refusing your invitation would have created different complications, so I'm not sure there was winning move in that situation. There wasn't, which is why I framed it as test of your principles, to see whether you'd maintain distance even when I explicitly requested engagement. Caliph leaned back in her chair. For what it's worth, you passed the test by acknowledging the complications while accepting the invitation. Someone purely interested in gaining access would have accepted without noting the political implications. Someone purely interested in maintaining principled distance would have refused regardless of my preference. I'm not sure pass the test is accurate description. I made complicated choice that satisfied neither principle completely. Chen shook his head. But I suppose that's often how actual decisions work, versus the clear binary choices that diplomatic theory assumes. Caliph found herself genuinely enjoying this conversation in ways she rarely experienced during formal exchanges. Chen wasn't performing deference or expertise. He was just thinking out loud about difficult situation while acknowledging his own uncertainty about the right approach. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "And I'm asking Elias rather than Ambassador Chen, if you're willing to make that distinction." "I can try, though I should note that the two aren't entirely separable. My diplomatic training influences how I think even in personal conversations." "Fair enough, but I'm interested in your actual opinion rather than your officially appropriate response." Caliph chose her words carefully. "You identified my isolation earlier, the reduction from person to symbol that comes with my position. Do you think that's inevitable given the role I hold? Or do you think there are ways to maintain personhood while still fulfilling the responsibilities of heir?" Chen was quiet for a longer period, clearly taking the question seriously. "I think it's extremely difficult but not necessarily inevitable. The challenge is that your role requires certain amount of performance. You have to represent the empire, have to maintain authority that your position requires, have to make decisions that affect millions of people based on political necessity rather than personal preference. That performance creates distance between who you are and who you're required to appear to be." He paused, considering. "But I've known people in positions of significant power who managed to maintain sense of self despite the performance requirements, usually by being very deliberate about creating spaces where they could drop the performance, where they could interact with people who saw them as individuals rather than as symbols. Those spaces were usually private, carefully protected, and involved people who had no political interest in the relationship, which is difficult to achieve when you're heir to an empire, and nearly everyone you interact with has some political interest in maintaining good relations with you." "Yes, which is why I said extremely difficult rather than impossible." Chen smiled. "Though I should note that this conversation is probably not example of apolitical space, given that I'm foreign envoy and anything we discuss will inevitably be analyzed for diplomatic implications." "True, though it's closer to genuine conversation than most interactions I have, which is something." Caliph considered her next question. "What would you do if you were in my position? How would you maintain personhood while fulfilling the role?" "I have absolutely no idea," Chen admitted. "I've never held hereditary power, never lived my entire life as public figure, never had to balance personal identity against symbolic representation of entire civilization. Anything I suggest would be theoretical advice from someone who who hasn't actually experienced your situation. But you must have some thoughts, even if they're theoretical. I suppose I try to be very deliberate about distinguishing between what the role requires and what you personally value, and then protecting the things you value even when they don't serve political purposes. Finding small rebellions against the performance, moments where you choose authenticity over political advantage, where you express actual opinion rather than diplomatically appropriate response, where you remind yourself and others that you're person making choices rather than symbol executing predetermined script. Chen paused. But again, that's easy for me to say from outside your situation. Actually doing it while managing the political consequences would be considerably more difficult. Caliph sat with that for a moment. The advice was both less specific and more honest than what she usually received from advisors, who tended to offer confident solutions to problems they didn't fully understand. Chen was acknowledging the difficulty without claiming to have easy answers, which felt more respectful of her intelligence than confident expertise would have. "I broke protocol today," she said, "during the formal ceremony. Stopped the proceedings to ask you directly why you were maintaining distance, then left the throne to speak with you more closely, then invited you to private meeting without consulting my advisors about diplomatic implications. Those were all small rebellions against expected performance. I noticed your court seemed surprised. They were shocked. I'm generally very careful about maintaining proper protocol during formal occasions, and today I decided that understanding your perspective mattered more than avoiding disruption." Caliph smiled. "I'm not sure whether that qualifies as protecting what I personally value or just being impulsive, but it felt significant." "Probably both. Significant choices often are." Chen was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something now?" And again, I'm asking Caliph rather than Her Highness, if you're willing to make that distinction. "I can try. What do you actually want from this conversation?" "I know what the political version of this meeting accomplishes. Demonstrates that you're willing to engage personally with human envoys, creates potential for enhanced cooperation, signals to your court that you value direct communication. But what does Caliph want from talking with me, beyond the diplomatic benefits?" The question was more direct than formal protocol would allow, but Caliph had invited exactly this kind of honest exchange. She considered her answer carefully. "I want to talk with someone who sees me as person first and princess second, who doesn't filter everything through calculations about political advantage or court protocol, who's willing to tell me when I'm wrong or when my perspective is limited by my position." She met his eyes. "And I think you might be capable of that kind of honesty, based on what you said earlier and how you've approached this conversation. That's significant responsibility you're placing on a foreign envoy you met approximately 3 hours ago." "Yes, which is why I said might be capable rather than assuming you definitely are." Caliph leaned forward slightly. "But I'm willing to take that risk if you're willing to try. Not as political alliance or diplomatic strategy, but as actual attempt at genuine conversation between people who happen to hold complicated positions." Chen looked at her with expression that suggested he was calculating risks and possibilities. "I'm willing to try," he said finally, "though I should warn you that I'm not particularly good at maintaining appropriate diplomatic distance once I've committed to genuine relationship. I tend to say what I actually think, which creates complications when dealing with people who prefer careful political language." "Good, I have enough people who tell me carefully appropriate things. I need someone who will tell me true things, even when truth is politically inconvenient." Caliph felt something settle in her chest, some tension she'd been carrying for years starting to ease. "Though we should probably establish some ground rules about confidentiality and how we handle information that emerges from these conversations." They spent the next hour working through practical details. How often they could reasonably meet without creating diplomatic complications, what topics were appropriate for private discussion versus what needed to remain in official channels, how they'd handle situations where personal relationship conflicted with political responsibilities. It was prosaic work, but necessary foundation for the kind of honest engagement Caliph was hoping to build. By the time Chen left her chambers, they'd established framework for ongoing conversations that would exist parallel to, but separate from official diplomatic relations. It wasn't friendship exactly. Too many complications and power differentials for that simple term. But it was genuine connection built on mutual recognition of each other's complexity rather than reduction to political symbols. Caliph's advisors would probably object to the arrangement, would worry about what influence a foreign envoy might gain through personal access to the heir. But Caliph had spent 18 years making choices based on political calculation rather than personal need, and she was discovering that sometimes the most valuable relationships were the ones that didn't fit neatly into diplomatic frameworks. Chen had been right about one thing. Strength could exist without dominance, and courage could mean choosing honesty even when silence would be safer. And maybe, Caliph thought, the most important act of sovereignty she could perform was deciding for herself who deserved her trust, regardless of what political protocol suggested.
Eu tentei, foi quando eu perdi a mina lá.
6 months after the throne room incident that had shocked the Lydrian court and prompted extensive diplomatic analysis, Elias found himself in Caliph's private chambers for what had become weekly conversations that existed in complicated space between friendship and political alliance. They developed rhythm to these meetings. Initial discussion of whatever current diplomatic or political situation was complicating their respective positions, followed by more personal conversation about the challenges of maintaining authenticity while performing required roles, occasionally punctuated by comfortable silences that neither felt obligated to fill. The arrangement had created exactly the political complications Elias had anticipated. His superiors in the human diplomatic corps were delighted by his apparent influence with the Lydrian heir, but also concerned about whether he was being manipulated for political advantage. Caliph's court officials were similarly divided between viewing him as valuable connection to humanity and worrying about inappropriate foreign influence on their future ruler. But the conversations themselves had remained genuine, characterized by the kind of honest exchange that Elias had hoped to protect by initially maintaining distance. Caliph would tell him about the frustrations of managing court politics while trying to implement reforms that her advisors found too radical. Elias would explain the challenges of representing humanity's interests, while recognizing that those interests weren't always clearly defined or particularly noble. They'd disagree about policy approaches, challenge each other's assumptions, and generally engage in the kind of direct conversation that both found refreshing compared to their usual carefully diplomatic exchanges. Today's meeting had started with discussion about trade negotiations that were currently stalled over competing environmental standards, had evolved into debate about whether cultural preservation or economic development should take priority in contested territories, and had somehow ended up with Caliph asking Elias to explain human concepts of privacy and autonomy that didn't translate cleanly into Lydrian cultural frameworks. Your species has this idea that individuals own their own lives, that personal choices shouldn't be subject to collective oversight unless they directly harm others, Caliph said, processing the concept with visible effort. That's fundamentally different from how my people think about individual responsibility to community. It's one of our core cultural values, though we're not always consistent about applying it, Elias acknowledged. We believe that people should have maximum freedom to make their own choices, even when those choices seem suboptimal to external observers. The trade-off is that We accept more social chaos in exchange for individual autonomy. And you think that's superior to our approach, where individual choices are guided by community values and collective benefit. No, I think it's different with different strengths and costs. Elias had learned over months of these conversations that Caliph appreciated when he challenged her assumption without claiming absolute answers. Your system creates more social cohesion and stability. Ours creates more individual freedom and innovation. Both have value depending on what you're optimizing for. Caliph was quiet for a moment, thinking, what would you choose if you were in my position? Individual autonomy or collective responsibility? That's not a fair question. You don't have the luxury of choosing one or the other. You're heir to an empire built on collective responsibility, and you can't simply decide to prioritize individual autonomy without destroying the foundations that make your civilization functional. Elias paused. But I think you can find spaces within that structure where you exercise personal autonomy, where you make choices based on what you value rather than what's politically expedient. Like these conversations. Like inviting you to meet privately despite my advisor's concerns about foreign influence. Caliph smiled. Small rebellions against the performance, as you once suggested. Exactly. Though I should note that your advisor's concerns about foreign influence aren't entirely unfounded. I am foreign envoy with personal access to you, and that access does give me potential to influence your thinking in ways that might benefit humanity's interests. Are you trying to influence my thinking right now? Probably, though not deliberately in service of humanity's strategic interests. I'm trying to help you think through difficult questions, because I care about you as person and want you to make good decisions. But those good decisions might align with human interests, which means my influence serves multiple purposes simultaneously. Elias had learned to be direct about his mixed motivations rather than pretending to pure altruism. I can't claim to be entirely apolitical advisor, because my position and loyalties mean I'm always partially political even when I'm being personally genuine. I appreciate the honesty about complexity. Caliph leaned back in her chair. Most of my advisors pretend that their advice serves my interests purely, without acknowledging that they also serve their own interests and their political faction's interests. You at least admit that your motivations are mixed. It seems more respectful than claiming purity I don't possess. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and Elias noticed how much easier this had become over months of practice. Initially, any pause in conversation had felt weighted with political significance, as though silence needed to be filled with appropriate diplomatic content. Now, they could just exist together without constant performance. I need to tell you something, Caliph said eventually, and I'm not entirely sure how you'll respond, but I think our agreement about honesty requires me to share it. I'm listening. My father is preparing to abdicate within the next 2 years. It's not public knowledge yet, but succession timeline has been accelerated, which means I'll become ruling monarch considerably sooner than the political projections suggested. She met his eyes. And when that happens, these private conversations are going to become significantly more complicated, because I'll no longer be heir with some flexibility about who I meet with. I'll be reigning monarch whose every relationship carries enormous political weight. Elias felt something sink in his chest, though he wasn't entirely surprised. He'd known these conversations existed on borrowed time, that eventually political reality would make them impossible to sustain in current form. How do you feel about that timeline? He asked because personal questions seemed more important than immediate political calculation. Terrified, excited, overwhelmed, ready in some ways, completely unprepared in others. Caliph's voice carried vulnerability she rarely allowed herself in political contexts. I've been preparing for this role my entire life, but actually assuming it feels different from theoretical preparation. And I'm going to lose a lot of the freedom I currently have. including probably the ability to maintain these conversations in anything like their current form. I understand. The political complications of reigning monarch having private weekly meetings with foreign envoy would be substantial. Yes, which is why I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly rather than diplomatically. Caliph took a breath. Do you want to continue this relationship after I assume the throne, even though it will require significantly more political maneuvering and will probably create complications for both of us? Or would you prefer to transition to purely formal diplomatic relationship that's easier to manage but less personally meaningful? Elias considered the question seriously. Continuing the relationship would mean navigating considerably more political complexity, would create expectations and complications he couldn't fully anticipate, would require constant balancing between personal connection and professional responsibility. Transitioning to purely formal relationship would be cleaner, safer, more appropriate given the power differential that would exist once she was ruling monarch. But he'd spent 6 months in conversations that had become genuinely important to him, had watched Caliph work through complex challenges while maintaining remarkable integrity, had developed relationship that mattered beyond its political utility. I want to continue, he said finally. Though I think we need to be very deliberate about boundaries and very honest about when political responsibilities have to take precedence over personal connection. We'll need to formalize aspects of the relationship to satisfy political protocol, while protecting the genuine elements that make it valuable. Agreed. I've been thinking about possible structures. Regular scheduled meetings that serve diplomatic function while allowing space for actual conversation. Clear protocols about what topics can be discussed privately versus what needs official channels. Explicit acknowledgement that our relationship serves multiple purposes simultaneously. Caliph was shifting into planning mode. It won't be as simple as what we have now, but I think it's possible to maintain something genuine while satisfying political requirements. They spent the rest of the meeting working through practical details, establishing frameworks that would allow them to continue their conversations once Caliph assumed the throne. It was complicated work that required balancing personal desires against political realities, but they'd had enough practice with that kind of balancing to approach it with reasonable confidence. When Elias left her chambers that evening, he was carrying detailed notes about proposed structures and protocols, along with awareness that their relationship was evolving into something more formally complicated but potentially more sustainable than its current informality. The throne room incident had started this. His honest answer about maintaining distance out of respect for her isolation. And now they were building on that foundation to create relationship that honored both personal connection and political responsibility. 2 years later, when Caliph formally ascended to the Lydrian throne, one of her first official acts was establishing the position of human cultural liaison, with unprecedented access to the monarch for purpose of facilitating understanding between civilizations. The position was offered to Elias, who accepted with full awareness of the political complications, while valuing the opportunity to continue conversations that had become central to both their lives. The court officials analyzed the appointment extensively, trying to determine what strategic advantage Caliph was seeking through maintaining close relationship with human envoy. The human diplomatic corps celebrated Elias' elevation, while quietly worrying about whether he'd been compromised by personal loyalty to alien monarch. Neither group quite understood that the relationship's value lay precisely in its refusal to be purely political or purely personal, in its simultaneous acknowledgement of multiple purposes and motivations. Caliph and Elias continued their weekly conversations, now formalized as cultural liaison briefings, that satisfied protocol requirements while preserving space for genuine exchange. They disagreed about policy, challenged each other's assumptions, and generally maintained the kind of honest relationship that both found valuable despite its complications. And when historians later analyzed this period of Lydrian-human relations, they noted the unusual partnership between monarch and liaison, the way it seemed to facilitate cooperation that traditional diplomatic channels had struggled to achieve. They speculated about political calculations